Hello, my name is Leila McKenzie-Delis, founder and CEO of Dial Global, and you are watching the CEO Activist podcast. We decided to start this podcast because we wanted to do something really special and really unique, and something that involved the modern CEO, the forward-thinking, innovative CEO of the current day times that really cares about putting the S in ESG and utilizing diversity as a commercial lever with which to drive change for economic growth and long-term prosperity. Stay tuned because we have got some epic guests on the show. Today, I'm joined by Mark Coleman, founder and CEO of Unleash. Mark is leading the charge when it comes to revolutionizing human resources and the industry when it comes to community, technology, future trends, and AI. So would love to kind of get into things and perhaps even unpick some of the how did it all happen, because you really are revolutionizing the way the human resources, the industry comes together through community, with tech, with AI, and navigating what is not only a geopolitically complex landscape, but one that is in such a hot area, so to speak.
So to go back on the early days of it, I'm a born researcher, so I'm a scientist by trade. My education is microbiology and biochemistry, which I think sets you up for the basics of event management, because I don't think there was any event management courses, or I'm not sure it existed as a discipline in my youth. But if you look at science, it's kind of, you look at experimentation, it's got a start, a middle, and an end. It's got apparatus, it's got magic ingredients, it's got procedure, and it's got the conclusion or the execution. And there's no black, for a world that's black and white, there's often a gray area. And that's what I love about research the most, which is that regressive analysis, it's called. It's like, why is that dot there and it shouldn't be there? And that's what I love about the world of events, and the world of building events. I don't look to create, I'm looking for that dot. I want to be an outlier, and it's not about creating something else that's kind of already exist, or I found that when I got into the HR industry, that everything looked the same. It was tired. A lot of people ask the question, how did you disrupt the events industry, particularly around HR and future of work? And it wasn't that difficult, to be quite honest, because it was very tired. Everything looked the same, and the events industry in general, and I think the pandemic called it out, hadn't innovated in years and years and years. And so this move to digital and let's give virtual a go, and we'll save loads of money on flights and in person. I mean, there was people on podcasts like this suggesting that the world of events was on its knees and it would never come back. But I think we're into the golden age of events. So I see this as being the really disruptive and innovative period of our industry. And I'm loving it and hating it at the same time. So 12 years later, it's about building a business that's remote first. Events people are social animals, so we like to get in a room together. That's why we've chosen this vocation. So to try and build a business with a group of people from the industry remotely has been probably the hardest thing I've ever done. And we've gone through 2 years of it, and you've enjoyed the most recent version in Paris. And it's that kind of, I would just say, that cadence of the way the last 18 months have played out since we kind of resurrected or kind of said we're still alive, we're still here. It's that cadence that we've gone through now, and what the team have learned, and that institutional knowledge that we lost, that we bring forward now. So I'm really, really excited for 2024.
Mark, you've described that so beautifully and articulately, if you don't mind me saying. And I'd love to pull back into something that you alluded to with this whole, it's like the light and the dark of working not only as an entrepreneur, where, I mean, I personally find that it is often an emotional roller coaster, but also dealing with those fabulous people that say, oh, do you know what, that's it, the events industry is over, because you've absolutely proved them wrong. And I don't know about you, but it gives me extra fire in my belly to then want to show that actually you got to move with the times. Tenacity, emotional intelligence, and all of those other great aspects of humans is what makes them continue to kind of drive forward and strive into new and often better uncharted territory.
That's it. It's the terra incognita, the uncharted territory, and that's what I love the most. I love to play in that area the most. And if I look at it, I suppose it's, to your point, the peaks and troughs, the mental well-being that everyone's gone through. I don't use it flippantly, but I think we're into the golden age of events. I've talked to all of our customers recently in different customer groups. So what the analysts get from coming to Unleash in terms of that final face-to-face, because they spend an awful amount of time in the books, in the research, in the numbers, in the surveys and stuff like that. And so for them to get the briefings, to get face-to-face with everything, and that's it. You can't beat the face-to-face. You can't beat it. And I'll talk to our biggest customers, and they've got significant pipeline off the back of the deal making that goes on at the show. It can be a sentence that changes people's minds. It can be one connection, and I see that all the time. Some people find a job at Unleash, a new job or a future employer. It doesn't have to be immediate. It could be in 2 years' time or 4 years' time. And that's the game, and that's all of that together is community, and that's where I find myself after a really tough campaign post-pandemic. That's where I find that the smile on the face, the energy, when people tell me it was really easy to have those big conversations, like they were falling into conversation. And so when you have thousands of people in a room like that, you might not achieve the same result with 100 people in a room, but being able to create that what would you call it, that safe space for everyone to have big conversations about their careers, what's their biggest pain point. I mean, that's often the thing, right? You kind of want to hear other people that might be having or going through the same pain, because in that is a little bit of solace, but there is insight and advice and recommendation. And of course, it's like everyone wants to fast track their careers, and most people in our industry have a growth mindset, so it's a kind of a natural, I want to be successful in life. I want my team to be successful. I want my company to be successful. So yeah, that's what I've taken off the back of the last 3 years.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also very sensible when you kind of look at it from afar. How else do we best learn and maintain our knowledge of the trends if it is not for that peer-to-peer learning, sharing transferable methodologies, viewing from a holistic point of view what other organizations are doing, and keeping up with those trends in such a fast-paced VUCA world, as they call it. And I guess before we kind of get into some of the future trends, because I would love us to spend some time talking about the future of work, what we see into 2024, as well as how diversity, inclusion, and the human aspects start to align, because already, ESG, or the S in ESG, the role functions are significantly changing. Before we get into that, I'd love just to go right back into some of your whistle stop tour around your career, because you'd mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, you really, kind of regressive analysis, data analysis, being a researcher is how you came to be. But doing the microbiology degree, microchemistry, being analyzing things within corporates for organizations like the Microsofts of the world, it seems from the outside such a big transition, but clearly there's a huge need there. And so I'd just love to know a bit about the founder story, because I think that's something really interesting that I've heard a lot about from peers of yours, and I think it would be remiss of me not to give you a moment just to talk through some of that and how you've seen the market change personally, professionally over the years.
Cool. Well, I fell into HR. I wasn't a founder that kind of stood there looking at the HR industry per se. My career has always been in events. I've always had the entrepreneurial gene since a teenager. You don't get that career advice when you're in school per se. I don't know what your career guidance counselor was like, Leila, but I was definitely not getting a sense of like I might have an entrepreneurial DNA or a world of events is kind of your future, and you'll get to travel the world and things like that. So on the HR piece, if I get into it, it was initially I started as a researcher, did some work for the Economist Intelligence Unit, if you're familiar with the magazine. And that was my intro, and then I kind of found myself working around companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, who else, Hay Group. There was a bunch of the big advisory firms that I was doing work for, whether it was research or helping them with their events. And I suddenly found I'm kind of meeting all the same people all the time, and I'm meeting the same trends and stories. And it was interesting. It was, and I think everyone back then, this kind of been, I'm not sure it'll ever go away, but the HR industry has an affliction of the people that are educated into it are not necessarily know what they're getting themselves into, or by design, they, it's quite unique, because a lot of people, I put it down to, especially in the old days, people maybe not getting into their psychological degree course with enough points from school, and then kind of going organizational psychology. Well, that's the next best thing. Let's have a go at that. And so what you're seeing is a lot of youth that have gone into HR degrees, going in there and getting textbook stuff, but then going into a corporate world that's completely different. And I want to say this, and I think there might be still a little bit of this, not knowing how to have a meeting, not knowing how to project plan, not knowing how to make a phone call. Just the very basics of day-to-day business. And I think there was this thing where my observations were HR, everything that was being designed was HR for HR, if that makes sense. And I'm going to say that was in the early noughties, or throughout the noughties. And I think when the cloud came along, this tech revolution, which was SaaS and cloud, and Workday being the belle of the ball exactly around that time, you had this massive movement where employees were able to decide on what technology they were going to use. And I was sat in Chelsea Football Club doing, I suppose it was a round table for about 50 CHROs. I have a history of messing things up, so I got that one terribly wrong. I took them to the Champions League football as the kind of the first day, and then the second day was they were meeting a gentleman called Professor John Boudreau for a full day masterclass on day 2. And so we went out and did the football. Everyone had a few drinks that night. And so it was people didn't feel the best for the workshop the next day, let's say. At that event, there was maybe 5 or 6 people told me, Mark, you've got to get your arms wrapped around this opportunity that is HR, the HR cloud. There's massive revolution going on at the moment. And I took a look at it for a few weeks and then decided, okay, the business I've been building over here for, CHRO thought leadership, it's quite tough, not really scalable. Again, founders tend to talk about this all the time. And where can I make a difference? Where can I add real value with what I've learned over the last two and a bit years? And yeah, it was a no-brainer. I worked on this, and again, as a researcher, is where my research skills come back to life. Finding out why all the other HR technology events in particular hadn't succeeded before, because there was plenty of them, but none of them had gone to a V2 or a V3. And in that, I kind of saw this revolution of employee empowerment for all of those years, where you've kind of come up to date now, and it's all about employee experience. And we've been on that journey for a while, and again, it's not going away. But yeah, if I look at it, it was really funny. HR for HR, and then HR for the employee was the biggest. Like, that's what I enjoyed in my first real decade working in HR. And now I'm into my second, and it's like, it's purpose, it's meaning, it's employee experience, it's diversity, it's all the things we've talked about before.
Mm-hmm. It's
does that answer the question? Sorry.
It does, and what I'm getting from that is essentially that it has been it's been an evolution this last decade, coupled with the pandemic, coupled with what historically the role of the CHRO or the HR people leader may have looked like before, layering top of that technology and the fact that actually what was textbook back then is no longer the state of play. It's how do you transform learnings into real world connections, because had it have not been for some of those early interventions, the research background and the futurist in you, again, I'm very similar myself. It was never an intentional piece, but actually you've been drawn to it like a butterfly almost. But how that then has transpired into finding, meaningful connections, opportunities out of something that might not have looked like anything from the surface level, and actually running hard and fast, knowing that there is something that can make a broader impact to the world. And let's face it, large organizations need that support. They absolutely need that support. We've got 5 generations in the workplace right now. So you talk of purpose and finding meaning in what we're doing. That is absolutely critical. And if we don't do that, we'll never retain the talent that's coming in right now and allow that to break through the lofty levels of the C-suite.
It's a fair point, and even the history of HR, even to make it simpler, it's it's been HR forever, and lots of people have had the idea to change the name. Lots of people have said it to me this year again. And then it became human capital, which the American government still adopts. So if you're at NASA, it's the Chief Human Capital Officer. And then it's pre-pandemic, it was Chief People Officer. I like to use the P for Chief Pandemic Officer. And you've seen HR go from kind of maybe the old seat at the table conversation. I was part of that back in the day. It was a long time ago, and I've got the grey whiskers to show for it. But it's really come up to date now, and you've seen HR, okay, seated at the table, but you've seen it come up right next to the CEO on most leadership teams. And if we were having an argument about which is the most important function in an organization, then it's never been more evident that it is talent, skills, purpose, meaning, and so the P would have been pandemic officer. It was like, how do we keep our people safe? And now it's purpose. How do we keep them? How do we retain them inside our businesses? So, so that's the story. I like, you know, it's an easy story to weave, but that has been the journey for HR.
Mm-hmm. I think it has another level of gravitas than it did before the pandemic. Look, I'm biased, so I believe that the role of the chief people officer, the chief human capital officer, the chief diversity officer are, you know, the most important across the piece, because they are literally they're mile wide rather, and they're mile deep. In many instances, sitting as a strategic advisor to the CEOs, because there's the engagement piece internally. There's also, you know, what is the external narrative that we're, you know, coming to the table with when it comes to even our investors now. You know, activist investors for whatever people may think of them, amongst other leading trends, is meaning that role is, you know, I don't think it'll ever need to fight its way now to get a seat at the boardroom table, because without it, there is no business.
100%, especially that last piece that we were talking about, reinvestors, more and more, or literally across all investors I know, it's so important to them.
Mm-hmm. So can we get geeky and talk then about the future together, and where we see some of the key trends? Because, you know, for me, whether controversial or not, diversity is a commercial lever for economic growth and prosperity. And what we've seen is this significant rise of the social aspect within ESG, even though I'm not convinced yet that people know exactly how to measure it. But you'd alluded to it through a number of places within our conversation thus far. And that is, you know, it's the knowledge capital, it's the human capital, it's the social capital, it's the connections that bind us. How do you put a specific figure on that when it is the bread and butter of our organizations and the future, and engagement ultimately that equals productivity? You know, what else are you seeing the HR and diversity leaders and even CEOs, to that fact, ought to be looking out at ahead of the 2024 world?
I think it's interesting because we've done advisory boards on this year, and obviously diversity has been a big part of that. It's interesting, America versus Europe. In America, a lot of, you know, and it's red hot topic. It's almost scary. It's like talking about politics or religion in the States when you get into the diversity conversations. But and I think this is the outcome, is that in our research, it's telling us that a lot of diversity initiatives in the US, in corporate America, are failing. They're not working. They're not punching through. And I think here in Europe, it's different, and it's different for the reasons that we're European. I worked on one of the early days. There was a thing called forced quotas in Norway, and it was about putting 2 women on every board. It's a long time ago. It was again in the early noughties, and it's quite an important project for where we stand today. And never did I think how important it was going to be, because again, back then there was a lot of naysayers. There was a lot of people had an opinion, women as well, in that you had to earn that position or that seat at the table. But that's gone full ways around the world, but it's spread through Europe in terms of a level of maturity before it's gotten to America. And then I would say, what's his name at Salesforce's, Mark Benioff is probably a great example of somebody who's really took the charge or grabbed the bull by the horns in terms of diversity and equal pay and stuff like that. Fast forward up to today, so comparison, look, this is the current status, or this is what we're hearing from our network and our community in the United States, versus Europe, which is more strategic and embedded and invested and more complex because of language and everything else. And I think maybe that flourishes as well, but the common union, the European Union, I know it has its naysayers, but there are a lot of directives coming through from the European Union that are both policy and very well thought out, because it's the European Union. Everything is complicated and built on the back of many arguments and negotiations and everything else. So it just doesn't land there and kind of go, we've got a great idea, we spent 3 months on this. The reality is, if it's European Union policy, it's probably spent 3 years in the making or longer. So you've got a few initiatives coming through where if you're a company of 250 people and above, you've got to be hitting diversity metrics. There's a new one coming up. I was talking to Anita Latinka on this recently. Equal pay is the biggie, and that's becoming legislative. So whilst the top 100 maybe to 500 companies in Europe are prepared, pretty prepared for that, most companies aren't. And that's a significant number of companies that are 10,000 and above employees, tend to be called family businesses in Europe. So I think there's legislation on a number of different levels coming through in the next 2-3 years, and yeah, I think Europe gets to lead the way. I love this from where we stand, because we get to be champions, we get to be part of this, we get to lead the way with the European Union for the rest of the world. So yeah, really, really excited by the way this is evolving over here, and I think it has a different level of maturity.
I agree, and so what I'm getting from everything you're saying there, and I probably said I agree too many times, so I'm trying to find something I don't agree with you on, but 2025 and beyond, it's going to be a watershed moment. I mean, we know that legislation is changing. We've seen still very, very challenging geopolitical issues which are happening right now. Goodness, won't even go into kind of the Israel-Gaza conflict and everything like that, but Supreme Justice Court action over in the States versus what's happening, with everything with, UK politics and the likes, is almost that, and I'm not just saying this to promote Unleash in any way, but it's almost the case that leaders cannot afford not to stay abreast of the trends and the changing legislation. One of the things that we have seen is an increase in the need for crisis communications as well, in particular for senior leaders and even CEOs. So where you mentioned the safe space at the beginning of this conversation, having communities that matter, having communities to be able to share full knowledge, research, future trends and insights has, in my opinion, never been more critical than it is right now. I had a conversation with one of our members recently, and she coined this term that I just loved. We talk a lot about what's the return on investment, and at times I find that a frustrating conversation, because it's like, look, do we need to continually talk about what the case for change and the reasons why diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, culture, people, resources are something that's absolutely necessary? It should be an obvious now, and it's the right thing to do, of course, there's a human need. But she mentioned the impact of inaction, or the IOI instead of the ROI, and I thought, I absolutely love that, so much so we're making it one of our subjects for discussion in the new year at our online summit. And I thought, what is that impact of inaction? Because as you say, all of these things are changing. You can't afford not to have the peer-to-peer knowledge and stay abreast of things, because we've seen too many organizations and their leaders come crashing down because of someone saying something that has been either misconstrued in the media or has been something that has not been taken palliatively for right or wrong reasons, because people can go on Twitter, they can be opinionated, younger generations certainly can. When something blows up about certain human rights issues, the cost to the organization is sometimes off the Richter scale. And so what's the impact of inaction versus the return on investment? I think it's a super fascinating subject, and led with the fact that there are significant changes in legislation. I think that the wealth economy framework, which is all around this knowledge, human, social capital beyond GDP and beyond USD, that'll be coming into play in 2025. And so it's it's a really really interesting place to be over the next couple of years.
You're right on that as well, and I've forgotten to say, whilst I talk about Europe in that way, excuse me, the Supreme Court have done a ruling on affirmative action as well, so which is causing organizations to reaffirm their DEIB strategies and adopt new legal realities. And you've seen it recently. I would say the pain of, like, you know, when you talk about the conflicts in the world, poor old Elon can't keep his mouth shut on stage or on his own platform. And they've suffered significant consequences. So I don't know if he's trying to actually kill Twitter, or is he trying to, is it a kind of phoenix, like something that needs to, you know, die, and he's trying to get it's odd.
Born somehow out of the ashes, yes.
Paddy Cosgrove from Web Summit suffered the same affliction. He decided he wanted to have a political opinion and had to fire himself from his own company. So it's there's yeah, you're spot on. But I think there is a big move towards systemic DEIB, and I'll be careful here, because Josh Burson and the gang have just launched a really cool report on systemic HR. But if we were to borrow that title for systemic DEIB, and kind of authenticate that into the foundations of every organization that's out there, instead of the current reliance on high visibility or ad hoc DEI initiatives. And I think that's kind of like, that was my take from the advisory board we've had in the US. That's what I was feeling off it. And I think, you know, more equitable practices, and you know, HR needs to have a clear voice in all of this. And it's never owned by one department. So I think, you know, more targeted action around hiring, skills-based hiring especially, and exploring alternative talent pools. And if I was to give you a really cool story, I'm going to drop a name here, but he might not even know this, but I looked at the old Microsoft. One of my first jobs was at Microsoft in Seattle, and many years later, it was interesting to then invite the global head of hiring, which is a gentleman called Scott Pataski. I think he's since been CHRO, Starbucks, and a few other companies. But he was their global head of hiring, and he, for me, he was ahead of the curve by a decade and more. So he worked for Steve Ballmer. I don't know if you can remember. You're probably too young, but you might find him on YouTube dancing with Bill Gates and a few others. They were so disconnected from the world of work. I got like 5 or 6 software geeks down. It's the funniest thing you'll see on YouTube. But Scott was hiring at that time for diversity, bringing some really interesting, like, you know, like the outliers into the business. And you could see Microsoft is just going, it was on a downward trajectory, and it wasn't just the regulatory kind of, you know, what had come in from the US government, and they kind of, you know, got their knees cut off and weren't the same growth business that they used to be. And so I don't think Satya just arrived there and he's just the new guru. I think when he arrived in Microsoft, he had a really good base from which to work from. And I really put that down to Scott, whether he'd agree with it or not. But I put that down to him hiring for diversity. All that, it's a long time ago now. So I've seen what can become of like a big company when they get that right. But sometimes it's a pioneer, and that's the part of HR I love to wrap my arms around. Like, that's what we're always looking to showcase. To your point earlier on the trends, whatever you say about what's working and what's not working, everyone wants to know where you're going next, or am I going in the right direction?
I think pioneering is exactly the word for it. And it takes one or two, or many more brave souls at times to put the head above the parapet and say, right, I know I'm not going to please everyone, but we are going to hire someone who has a, be it different race, ethnicity, gender, so on and so forth, but not just because that from a not just that from a tokenistic point of view, but actually the lived experience is different, the skill set is different, and hence that brings the innovation and the pioneering piece to the table. But you always get that people being up in arms to start with, and then eventually everyone comes round to that way of thinking. I remember in some of my early days networking with very senior execs out on a golf club in Portugal. It's another story in into itself. And someone out there had said, Leila, you put your head above the parapet and you're going to get shot at. And it stuck with me even to this day, because it was kind of this warning of don't break what is right now. And it's a very specific industry. I won't mention which industry it was, but it was quite an archaic industry. And you kind of think, oh goodness, do I risk the career? Do I risk what people are going to think of me if actually I go out there, as you have, and as every good founder CEO has, and said, what, actually, let's look at doing things differently. If you don't have the pioneers, you never have things move forward. One of my favorite authors, who again quite controversial, is Robert Greene. I'm sure you know him, but those first people that have gone against the grain, and as you'd said before, there's these people that you mentioned, they were quite ahead of their time, but eventually people come round to that way of thinking and start to own it. But being the brave ones to do that to start with is always a challenging piece.
I've a good quote for you on that, and it's kind
Yeah.
of, it's a tease, right? As a founder, because it's your ideas. You get worried about people stealing your ideas, or or not even stealing them. It's just like if you give it out too early. But in China, they have a saying of the first bird to fly is the first to get shot down. So like, and it's hard to hear it as a founder, because you go, well, if I'm going to be, am I going to get shot down? But I think that's part of being a founder, being brave. Taking that first step is always the hardest thing to do.
Yeah.
And so I've often kind of, it's been a little bit of something I've kind of taken through my whole career, to just be careful as well, right? Because yeah, you gotta make sure if you are going to take flight, you're in a position of strength to do so.
Indeed, take flight, have a parachute or two there to help and support.
And a bulletproof vest.
Yeah, bulletproof vest, exactly. It's an interesting concept without kind of going totally off on topic. Spoken to, I namely kind of speak to, similar individuals like yourself, your CEOs, your CHROs and the likes. But I think there is a fear of, the idea theft situation. Actually, there is the, collaboration over competition. And there's also that piece around actually having an idea is one thing. We regurgitate them as the evolutions of each decade happen. The key is implementation, making it happen. The amount of people I've met over the years that said, I've had this great idea and I'm going to do this, which is where I commend you and what Unleash are doing. And I saw it firsthand when I met you in Paris, is saying you're going to do something is one thing, but actually orchestrating it and bringing and convening all those people together, that is the harder thing, I think, than having the idea, because ideas are many. Orchestration and actually putting your foot to the pedal and getting it done is quite another. Which I guess leads me on to, actually, let's talk about Vegas, because I'm hoping I'm going to see you in Vegas with everything that is going on. I see that you've got already brilliant kind of lineups ahead. You mentioned name dropping before. I'm going to do it here for you. You have had some tremendous people at your events over the years. Simon Sinek, who everyone knows, to mention just one, amongst some of the world's most thought-provoking, forward-thinking organizations. So talk to us a bit about some of the name dropping, and shamelessly tell us all about how fabulous Las Vegas is going to be next year.
I'm going to be careful here, because it's an Irish thing. you know, I can give up the ghost, but we're waiting till January before we make any big announcements on keynotes and stuff like that, because yeah, everyone's gone off for Christmas now. We are working on a few big names. You will have you will have the usual suspects. Look, our events tend to be different to everything else that's out there. You'll have CEOs on the programming. You will have, of course, your blend of CHROs. We will have the industry's leading labor economists on stage, and it will be a mad mix of about 250 speakers. It's 3 days. It's in Caesar's Forum, which is our new home. We did our first rodeo was this year, which for anyone in the world of events and even HR will know that, you know, doing an event from the other side of the planet is not the easiest thing to do. We're there for the foreseeable future. We are pointing it or badging it differently to Europe. I think Europe has the legacy of being our flagship event. It's more sophisticated, has a lot of different formats going on for it, whereas Vegas is a lot to do with strategic alliances. We have a strong vendor community base there. The future of work is born out of California nearby. We benefit in kind from that. What else can I tell you? We do pre-events as well. So we do summits all across talent acquisition, learning, HR tech, and strategic alliances. And then across the main 2 days, day 2 and day 3, the exhibition obviously opens up. It's got 4 stages, 200 vendors across the floor. And then the other, like the big stuff will be AI stage, stage 1, which is where you get all the keynotes, like, you know, your Simon Sinek's, Richard Branson, Esther Perel's, those type of personas, as well as obviously the best of the best that we can find in terms of, you know, case information or trends. You know, again, it's people need to hear it. You know, are we going into recession? Is the hiring market going to get more difficult? Is everyone having the same problem with skills? You know, and of course, there, you know, I think I said AI just a minute ago, but AI is obviously is going to dramatically change work in the next 2 to 3 years. You know, whatever timelines people had, they've gotten shorter, and it's now arrived without being Armageddon. So it's a choice of, do we want a Star Trek world or a Mad Max world? And I guess the market economy, the biggest thing kind of pulling all of this together as well, is dramatically changing as we speak, and is going across a similar timeline. So we have never, ever, ever, like, golden age of events is one thing, but we've never been in, you know, society has never been in such a, you know, that pivoting point in terms of exponential world. We are really on the exponential curve now, and yeah, it's mind-blowing, and kind of, you know, we're all a little bit worried about it at the same time.
Mm-hmm. I normally summarize at the end of a podcast, but I think you've absolutely outdone anything I could say there. Exponential world is absolutely it. And, you know, as the famous book says, feel the fear and do it anyway, and you do it tremendously well. So, Mark, thank you. Thank you ever so much. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer one of the lightning round questions, because I'm conscious that you and I could talk about trends literally until the cows come home. So I'll ask this one question, possibly the hardest actually, but for you now at this stage of your very successful career, you know, liaising with some of the best in the world, what would you say now is your secret to success?
Listening to the customer.
Great answer. Customer always comes first. I would expect something less futurist.
So I would say that, but to your point on customer, and I've just had a Christmas party with my team in London. I'm back here in Budapest now, but I would say it's team first, customer second. So if you don't have your team in a good place and they don't have the competencies and know-how and tools to be able to do their jobs. They're never going to get that customer experience to that level. But I think in terms of success, ideation and where we're going and what we need to do and who we need to become, the customer defines that. And in a really fun way, it's obvious sometimes. And then in a kind of Steve Jobs way, the customers doesn't know what it needed until it got a smartphone. Like they didn't know they needed an iPhone. And it's not to be arrogant, but sometimes you've got to be, future casting what the customer needs, even though they don't need it. So yeah, but I think listening to the customer, that's the best one I can give for any entrepreneur that's out there.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And it is, to your point, caveated by having the very best emotionally intelligent team that can tune into that need.
Yeah.
Mark, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. For those that would like to re-listen to the podcast, share the podcast, please do so. You've been listening to the fabulous Mark Coleman, founder and CEO of Unleash. Make sure you check them out. We've joined before in Paris. It was a superb couple of days, and very excited about things to come. Always nervous and in anticipation of some brilliant events that are going to be happening next year. My name's Leila McKenzie-Delis, founder and CEO of Dial Global. You've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, or any of your favourite podcast channels. Otherwise, visit us at www.dialglobal.org/podcast. See you very soon.